Hello, I am Michael Collins and this is Media Focus. In the previous video, we looked at how video games are a specialised industry, how they are different from every other media industry, how they do things completely differently in terms of their RRP and in terms of how they are interactive for audiences. And these processes, this idea of the video game industry being specialised, is also completely ingrained in their production, i.e. how video games are made as well. So what we're going to look at in this video is how video games are typically produced and marketed by major studios. And once more, it's really, really important to point out we are talking about major studios here. We're talking about the big boys. We're talking about the ones which spend huge amounts of money and the ones who expect to sell loads of copies of games and to make lots of money in return. So you might be asked in the exam, in what ways do video games represent a specialized industry or something along those lines? And you will be asked to draw specific examples from the Assassin's Creed series. But just before we do go into that, it will be really, really important just to kind of look at the structure of video game production. Now, when I was researching this video, I had this vague idea in my head of making this enormous video going through every single last stage of video game production. That it very, very quickly seemed like a bad idea. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to skip over pretty much everything. And if you are in the know, if you know about video game production, if you know how video games are made, you might be slightly annoyed by this. And, you know, anyone watching this video might be like, well, that's not really what... Okay, I'm skipping over loads and loads. But if you want to know more, just literally just Google video game production. Go on the Wikipedia page. You will find a much more in-depth outlook there, and then that will give you loads and loads of opportunities to research this. So yeah, let's just go through this. So the production of any media product can be split into three different phases. So we have pre-production, which is everything which happens before something's made. So in a film, for example, you might make a storyboard and write a script. Then you have the production, where you actually go out and make it. So when you're making a film, you might run outside and, you know, with your camera and you'll shoot it. And then you've got the post-production, which, again, for a film, you take that footage and then you edit that footage. Now, for video games, things are really, really different because they tend to be, well, they are produced on computers. They are coded on computers. Pre-production, production, and post-production are all essentially rolled into one, and there's, you know, much less distinguishing between these different phases. However, there are distinct phases in video game production, and as I said, I'm going to skip most of these and basically just focus on some of the slightly more interesting ones. So there's no real right or wrong way to make a video game, and different studios will do completely different things. But often one of the very, very first things which is done in video game pre-production is that concept art will be produced. Now, concept artists have one of the coolest jobs in the world. They essentially will sketch out cool and interesting and imaginative designs about what it is that the game might actually end up looking like. So here's some concept art for the Assassin's Creed series, and we have this interesting kind of misty vista. We have this Japanese setting, and we have this mishmash of different styles of more kind of Western characters with this kind of Japanese location in the background. And quite clearly, the final game isn't going to look like this. It isn't going to have that kind of watercolor, kind of washed out feeling to it, although some games do, and they look really, really cool. But instead, the whole purpose of concept art is in order to inspire the designers when they actually knuckle down and start making the game. Is this idea that everybody in the studio has this shared vision. This is what we're aiming for. Back in the 80s, concept art would completely differ from the final art from a video game, because essentially video games are much, much lower resolution and they were made on much weaker hardware. But these days, concept art and the final product actually end up looking fairly similar in a lot of ways due to advances in technology. And concept art will then often lead into the design of the game. So often we have a game development book, or sometimes called a development Bible or something along those lines. This can, in some cases, be a couple of pages of scribbled notes, and in some cases can be hundreds and hundreds of pages long. So the game development document, the design document, will often include sketches, it will often include notes, it will often include complete descriptions of every location, descriptions of every character, a rundown of the entire plot or narrative from start to finish, in order so that everybody working on the game can work from exactly the same rulebook. So this is something which is really, really important. If we consider exactly how many people work on a video game, if everyone was going off and doing their own thing, then you would not only end up with a mess, but you would also end up with a mess which would be completely impossible to stitch together because everyone will be doing their own thing. If everybody is working from the same book, from the same hymn sheet, then we can come to these conclusions about what needs to go into the game, and things are consistent, like things like characters' names and the world around them. So we can see here a design sheet from the Mario series here, and this kind of indicates exactly how the player might be expected to move through the challenges of a level, and it also indicates the things like the trajectory of certain enemies and stuff like that. So the design booklet can be completely different depending on what kind of game that we're looking at here. Essentially, after things have been designed and after things have been put forward, then the game itself needs to be coded. And if you've got some, dream about being a video game developer, one thing which is really, really important to get your head around is that you essentially will need to utilize maths. You will need to utilize coding. You will need to use things like hexadecimal number tables and things like that. It all gets very, very techie, very, very quickly. It's a specialized industry which requires specialized people in order to do this. So essentially, coders will essentially need to put together various forms of machine language, of computer language, in order to make all the cool things that we see on screen happen. So this is where it all comes from. It's extremely labor intensive. I took this image here from DMA's, studio in the 1990s when they were busy making the game Grand Theft Auto. DMA later changed into Rockstar Games and are now one of the biggest studios on the planet. At this stage, they were slightly more run down, slightly more rough and ready, but we still get the general picture that essentially video games are made by people putting very, very long hours behind computers and using all kinds of high-end mathematical techniques in order to get this stuff to work. Then after stuff has been coded and after characters are put on screen and after menus are shoved in and maybe even, we're going to skip over things like music and stuff like that in order to keep things simple. The game itself actually needs to be tested. Now, it's all very well for planners and producers to go, yeah, that's brilliant, that's excellent. But there are all kinds of issues with this process. You need to get fresh eyes on it. You need to get somebody actually playing the game. And testers are employed by video game production companies in order to rake through video games and to make sure that there are no bugs. Now, a bug is a problem with a code. Let's just say you're controlling your character, you're walking around, and then suddenly you get stuck in a wall. You can't get out. You have to, the game might crash or something like that. This is a bug. And testers essentially will play through looking for bugs and looking for issues. It seems like a pretty attractive job, although everything I've heard, basically insinuates that it's very, very hard work. It's very long work. You don't get paid very much. But, for a special kind of person, this might be, quite fun. But essentially, you're going through the code, you're going through the a game, you're playing it in order to try and make issues happen. So then the coders can then go back and then change things. And during production, we have what is known as alpha and beta builds. Now, the alpha build is the rough cut of a video game. It is where there are issues with the game. It's where stuff doesn't quite work. Here's a GIF from an alpha version of an Assassin's Creed game there. You can see there's just a couple of graphical glitches and kind of issues there. But the alpha build is one which can be tested, is one that can be played, and in general, although it might be filled with bugs, it is still playable. And after it's been corrected and after the bugs have been squashed, then producers can move on to what we call a beta build. Now, the beta build is the one before the final build, and this is where all the bugs have been changed, and basically it's pretty much polished, but there might just be a couple of issues with it at this stage. Often the beta build might be the one which is sent out to journalists. It might be the one that's sent out to trade shows and stuff like that. In sometimes, if a game is particularly anticipated, then the beta build might even be leaked. It might be leaked onto the internet. People might download it. This is a huge issue for video game producers, as this does not reflect the quality of the final product. And there might be years of difference between the alpha build and the beta build. So we can start to see exactly how much work goes into video games. After a video game has been completely made, well, it's not even finished there. Previously, back in the good old days, once a video game had been released, if there's an issue with it, well, essentially you were screwed. You just had to play it anyway. And there are a couple of examples of even fairly high-profile games which have huge issues with them. However, now, thanks to digitally convergent technology, it is possible to patch video games after their release. And if you do play video games, you'll often notice this. If you've got updates on automatically, you'll notice that video games might just update and they might be patched. And then this will change things like game balance. For example, one of my favorite video game series, the Dark Souls series, typically when it is first released, it is far too hard. And essentially what will happen is over a period of weeks and months, judging on player feedback and all the data that the developer FromSoft get from players playing the game, the developers will actually go back to the game, will make little changes to what we call the game balance, so which things should be harder or easier or just kind of tweaked slightly, and then this can be updated with a patch which can be digitally released over the internet, can then be downloaded and then installed in order to make the game better. And this has led to a situation we sometimes call day one patches, where essentially often games are shipped basically unfinished, and you will have to download often an absolutely massive patch on day one in order to make the game playable. So this is a completely different situation to what we had even 10 years ago. That would just be unthinkable. But now, thanks to digital technology, this is something which has often become a necessity, with video games working to extremely tight deadlines and absolutely huge budgets. After the video game has actually been made, or maybe when it's in its beta build, it needs to be marketed and promoted. Otherwise, no one is going to care about it when it finally gets released. Probably the most famous form of marketing and promotion for video games is the Electronics Entertainment Expo, or E3. This is an absolutely massive industry event which is held in America yearly, and this gives an opportunity for major developers to display their games. This event, in order to go, you have to be involved in the video game industry in some way. You have to be a journalist, ideally. And the idea is you go along, you watch all these promotional videos, and then you write good things about them in your publication, hopefully, if they're good. E3 is an extremely competitive environment, as we can see from this screenshot here. So this is Microsoft's announcement, their event, their whatever. And we can see the absolutely huge audience. We can see the absolutely huge amount of props and cool stuff on screen. And the videos which are released to E3, the trailers, the announcement trailers, it's generally assumed that big news will happen at E3. And video game fans, even if they can't make it to the event, will watch things like streams online. And the Assassin's Creed series really makes and breaks its reputation based on these extremely expensive and lavish trailers which will be released during E3. And the whole purpose of these trailers is to drum up expectation for the video games, which links into this idea of Henry Jenkins' notion of fan theory, that we can watch the trailers, we can check them out, and then we can talk about them online, and we can start getting excited about a video game that actually we'd never even heard of until a few weeks ago. And we're going to be looking in some detail at some of the trailers for the Assassin's Creed series in subsequent videos. Finally, everything we've been looking at is all completely about major label video game production. But I just also wanted to point out that we can chuck all of that out the window. You don't need to have a huge team to make a video game. In fact, many of the best video games out there are made by a single person. So on the left, we have a screenshot of a utility, which you could all download on Steam right now if you wanted to. Older versions of it can be downloaded for just a couple of quid at the moment. This program is called RPG Maker, and it allows independent producers, even with no knowledge of making video games, to mash together an old school role-playing game, which can then be released, can be digitally released or even physically released. So one of the most important and popular ways of indie game developers releasing games is digitally online. Although there are many, many examples of physical copies as well. So on the right, we have the huge Japanese fan and culture event Comiket, which is held twice a year in Tokyo. And this is an event where independent or doujin video game producers can take along their product and to try and sell it at the event to audiences who they normally would not be able to reach otherwise. So in spite of everything I've been saying about these huge production costs, about this development, about alpha beta testing and blah, 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 we've also got to realize that there are other video game developers who are doing completely different things as well.